sun may be shining, although it is cloudy today.
It was 1867. The Civil War had been over for 2 years. The first transcontinental railroad was being built. Pioneers, unwilling to wait for the train, headed west in covered wagons. That year, Laura Ingalls was born near Pepin, Wisconsin. She would grow up and write about her memories as a pioneer girl in Wisconsin, Indian Territory, Minnesota, and Dakota. Pa and Ma worked hard to feed and clothe themselves and their daughters. But life as seen through the eyes of little Laura was pleasant, exciting, and secure. The best time of all was at night, when Pa would play the fiddle. Self-sufficient and resourceful, Pa farmed and trapped. And he hunted, using a gun that he made the bullets for himself. Equally self-sufficient, Ma did her regular chores each morning, and then began the work that belonged to each day. Wash on Monday, iron on Tuesday, mend on Wednesday. Churn on Thursday, clean on Friday, bake on Saturday, rest on Sunday. Of course, there were special days with special events, like maple sugaring at Grandpa and Grandma's. The day of work ended with a big dinner for all the relatives and dancing to the tune of Pa's fiddle. One day when Laura was 6, she took her first trip to town. She rode 7 miles before she caught her first glimpse of Lake Pepin through the trees. Then there was a clearing, and she could see all of the beautiful lake. Right at the edge of the lake was the store where Pa came to trade his furs for all sorts of wonderful things. Laura thought she could have looked for weeks and not seen all the things that there were in that store. Farming in the big woods was difficult, but one day there was a new invention to help, the threshing machine. It was Pa who organized the neighbors to stack their wheat together and send for the new machine. By the next spring, the path that went by the little house had become a road. Pa longed to head west, where the land was level and where there were no other settlers. The Ingalls headed west in a covered wagon. They had to cross a creek that was fast-moving and angry, and they almost lost their dog, Jack. But finally, the Ingalls reached the prairie near the Verdigris River, where they would settle for a while. Laura wrote that on the whole enormous prairie, there was no sign that any other human being had ever been there. Pa and Ma began together to build their log house. Then they got help from a neighbor, who Laura always called Mr. Edwards. He lived 2 miles away. At the end of a day of hard work, Pa played Mr. Edwards down the road with old Dan Tucker. And when Pa finished the fireplace, Ma unpacked the china shepherdess that made every move with her. Their little house was in what was then called Indian Territory, but Pa thought that the Indians would keep moving west. The Indians didn't move on, so the Ingalls did. In their covered wagon, they traveled for several days. And finally, they reached the banks of Plum Creek in Minnesota. There they settled in a dugout, a single room hollowed out of the bank beside the creek. Early morning chores had Laura and Mary outdoors in time to watch the sunrise over the edge of the world. In the summer at Plum Creek, Pa built a wonderful house with 2 rooms. He bought sawed lumber from the sawmill on credit. He planned to pay for it with the fall harvest. Just 2.5 miles away was a school for Mary and Laura. They liked arithmetic and reading and writing. They liked spelling down on Friday afternoons. And Laura loved recess. The Ingalls didn't have much money. When the church needed just $3 more for a bell, Pa gave them the $3 he had saved for new boots. It was all he had. But the Ingalls were counting on Pa's good crops. When they could be harvested, the family would have lots of money. Then the grasshoppers arrived. There were thousands of them, eating everything in sight, until the prairie was bare and brown. The hot, awful summer was followed by cold, hard prairie winter. All the days ran together, with blizzard after blizzard. No sooner did one blizzard end with a day of cold sunshine than another began. Inside the house, the girls played games and used thimbles to make pictures in the frost on the windows. The next 2 years were hard ones for the Ingalls. But they always found a way to be happy at Christmas, even when there was no money for presents. Then baby Grace was born. She slept in a trundle bed under Ma and Pa's big bed. Mary and Carrie and baby Grace and Ma all were sick with scarlet fever. Mary became blind. Now Laura would have to see out loud for Mary, describing everything she saw. Pa gave up farming and took a job as a storekeeper and paymaster at a railroad camp. The camp was by the shores of Silver Lake in Dakota Territory. When Mary was strong enough, Ma and the girls followed Pa west, this time by train. In 1 hour, the train went 20 miles, as far as horses traveled in a whole day. At the end of the train ride, Laura met her cousin Lena and had her first horseback ride. At the railroad camp, Laura was fascinated by the way the surveyors measured the land and figured the railroad grade exactly. Then teams of men and horses worked together to make the grade. That winter, the Ingalls moved to the house the surveyors left. It was a real house with 2 stories and glass windows. Pa built Ma a whatnot with shelves made to fit in a corner. The girls decorated it. That was a happy winter. When spring came, the family moved to land outside town that Pa could claim for their own. Ma said their claim shanty looked like half a woodshed that had been split in 2. There, Pa planted 5 cottonwood trees. He said there was one for each of his girls: Ma, Mary, Laura, Carrie, and Grace. There was no money to pay for help, so 13-year-old Laura worked with Pa to haul and stack their hay. When all the upland hay was stacked, they cut the slough grass and put that up. It was free, and maybe they could sell it when the new settlers came in the spring. A mile away, the town of De Smet built up quickly, with storefronts lining Main Street. When enough money could be raised to build a church, Pa was among those who did the carpentry work. Ma and Pa were active members. Pa built a store of his own on Main Street, intending to sell it when new settlers came. Very thick muskrat houses, geese hurrying over the slough, seeming anxious to get south, and then an old man who stopped at the store in town, all warned of a long, hard winter. The family moved into town, into the new storefront Pa had hoped to be able to sell. At first, there were games in the snow. But then came the first of 7 months of blizzards. The temperature dropped to 40 below. Snow reached the rooftops. Pa had to dig a tunnel to get outside. The cuts filled with snow, burying 2 trains loaded with food and coal for De Smet. The railroad men gave up trying to dig the trains out before spring. The Ingalls survived by grinding wheat in a coffee mill to make flour. They took turns, winding the handle until their arms and shoulders ached so badly they couldn't do it anymore. When they ran out of coal, Pa and Laura twisted hay into sticks to burn. It was difficult work, but when the hay was twisted and knotted tightly, each stick was almost as hard as wood. In the cold lean-to next to the storefront, Pa and Laura could only twist a few sticks before they had to go inside to warm themselves. The Ingalls barely lived through that winter. But finally the long winter was over, and it was spring. The sun was shining warm, the winds were soft, and the green grass growing. The Ingalls moved back to their claim shanty. Ma and the girls took care of the claim so that Pa and Laura could walk to town each day to work. They all worked hard to save money and send Mary to an Iowa college for students who were blind. Laura basted shirts in a dry goods store for 25 cents a day, and Pa did carpenter work. There were happy times in De Smet, like the 4th of July celebration when the whole town turned out for horse races and lemonade. Despite the blackbirds spoiling the crops, the Ingalls did manage to start Mary at college in Iowa. When Laura was 15, she took her teacher's examination and was awarded a certificate to teach. Laura left home to teach at Brewster School, 12 miles south of town. She used her teaching salary to help Pa buy an organ for $100, especially for Mary. Laura missed Ma and Pa and her sisters. She was happily surprised when Almanzo Wilder, a young man from town, came to take her home for weekends. Almanzo appeared every weekend while Laura was teaching, and when the school year was over and she was home, he made excuses to see her. Almanzo came to take Laura riding in his new lazy-back buggy. They would ride out to see Lake Henry and Lake Thompson. And times got better for the Ingalls. Pa sold a cow to buy a sewing machine for Ma. It was just in time for Ma to use to sew Laura's wedding dress. Laura promised to love Almanzo, but not to obey him. She tells all about their wedding in the last chapter of these happy golden years. The first edition of that book ends with the words, "The end of the little house books." But it isn't, not really. Laura began a book about the first 4 years after she and Almanzo were married. She was unable to finish it, but what she did write has been published. The book includes the birth of the Wilders' daughter in 1886. They named her Rose, after the wild roses that grew on the prairie. Laura and Almanzo tried farming near Desmet, but they were unsuccessful. They decided to move on to a new place. Laura kept a diary of the long trip in their covered wagon. You can read it in On the Way Home. When the Wilders reached Mansfield, Missouri, they decided to settle there. Together, Laura and Almanzo built a home. They called it Rocky Ridge. Rose grew up, moved to San Francisco, and became a writer. Laura went to visit her. The letters she wrote to Almanzo during that time had been collected in West from Home. Rose encouraged her mother to write down her stories about her growing-up years. Laura began writing the little house books when she was more than 60 years old. She also wrote a book about Almanzo's childhood on a farm in New York. She called the book, and Almanzo, Farmer Boy. The Wilder family worked a lot on their farm, and they ate a lot. Almanzo's mother cooked huge meals, always with pies for dessert. And when the dishes were done after supper, they started again with apples and cider and popcorn. Almanzo grew his own pumpkin, feeding it milk. He won a blue ribbon for it at the county fair. Almanzo helped saw huge blocks of ice from the pond and pack them in the ice house. Buried in sawdust, they would not melt in the hottest summer weather. The Wilder farm still stands in Malone, New York. It looks much like Laura described it in Farmer Boy. Using Laura's books and some current highway maps as guides, you can travel the routes that Laura did. You might begin at Pepin, Wisconsin, where Laura was born. There, the Laura Ingalls Wilder Society has rebuilt the little house in the big woods. Next comes the long trip to what was called Indian Territory when Laura was a little girl. Just south of Independence, Kansas, there is a log cabin, much like the one Ma and Pa and Mr. Edwards built. Then it's north to Walnut Grove, Minnesota, another long trip, but you should be able to make it in less time than the Ingalls did in their covered wagon. You might want to take a look at the bell Pa helped pay for with his last $3. The church has changed, but the bell is the same. At the museum in Walnut Grove, you can see what the Ingalls covered wagon was like, and you can get directions to nearby Plum Creek. The Charles Ingalls family's dugout home was located here near Walnut Grove, Minnesota in the 1870s. This depression is all that remains since the roof caved in years ago. The prairie grasses and flowers have grown, much as they did in Laura's time, and the spring still flows nearby. Your next move might be to Desmet, South Dakota, where Pa went to work at the railroad camp. Except for the sign and the sidewalk, the surveyor's house looks very much the same now as it did when the Ingalls spent the winter there by the shores of Silver Lake. Brewster School, where Laura took her first teaching job, has been rebuilt on the same land as the surveyor's house. The cottonwoods Pa planted in 1880 still shade the claim site near Desmet. You can visit in your car the lakes Laura and Almanzo visited in their lazy-back buggy. In Desmet is the home that was the last one for Pa and Ma Ingalls. Ma's Bible and the lamp she used to read it are still there. A museum has crafts and books and photographs and other things that belong to the Ingalls. Laura's last move was with Almanzo to Mansfield, Missouri. Rocky Ridge has been kept the same as it was when Laura lived there, except that a museum and a gift shop have been added. There you can see the desk where Laura wrote all her books. It would be fun to visit all the places where Laura lived, but don't be too disappointed if you can't. Laura tells you all about them in her books.